Welcome to Hidden Karma Stories. I'm so glad you found this channel today. Before we dive in, if this story moves you, please like and subscribe. It truly helps more than you know. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Seriously, I read every single one. Now let's get into it. The wine hadn't even been poured yet when the hand came across her face. 1 second Margaret Calloway was sitting at a private dinner table with her hands folded in her lap. The next, she was turning her cheek from the force of a slap delivered in front of 11 investors, 4 executives, and 1 very expensive string quartet that missed its cue. The woman standing over her was her husband's assistant, Diane Foster, 29 years old, red dress that whispered money borrowed from someone else's reputation, hand still raised, lips curved with the kind of contempt that only comes when someone has been quietly rehearsing a performance. "Nobody raised you right," Diane said, loud enough that glasses stopped halfway to mouths across the table. "You don't know how to sit at a business dinner." Margaret turned her face back slowly. Her cheek burned, her eyes did not. At the head of the table, her husband, James Calloway, went pale so fast it looked like someone had pulled a drain beneath his skin. Not because his wife had been struck. Not because his assistant had just committed assault in front of people whose signatures he needed by morning. Because Margaret stood up. His hand shot sideways and knocked his water glass into a fork. "Margaret," he said low, urgent, "don't." That was his first mistake. She looked at him. The room held its breath. "Don't what?" she asked. His mouth opened, nothing came out. Diane laughed once, sharp and pretty. "See, this is exactly what I mean. You can't even find the right moment to be quiet." Margaret stepped around her chair. She wasn't tall. She wasn't dressed to compete with Diane's performance. She wore a simple charcoal dress and small diamond earrings, the kind of woman powerful men often mistook for tasteful furniture. James had spent a decade benefiting from that mistake. Diane lifted her chin, ready for tears, for a retreat, maybe a dignified exit toward the restroom. Margaret slapped her back. It wasn't wild, it was measured. The sound moved through the private dining room like a judge's gavel hitting oak. Diane stumbled 1 step. Her palm flew to her cheek. Her eyes widened in disbelief and then hardened fast into fury. James shot to his feet so quickly his chair hit the wall behind him. "Are you out of your mind?" he whispered. Margaret didn't look at Diane. She looked only at James. "That's an interesting question," she said. "Would you like to repeat it after I introduce myself properly?" The investors shifted. James's face changed. For 10 years he had told people his wife was private, reserved, elegant in the way that old money families preferred. What he had never told them, what he had never told Diane, was that the woman he'd spent years correcting in front of waiters held the private trust that had quietly kept his company breathing through 2 failed expansions, a federal audit, and the acquisition dinner they were sitting in right now. Diane had slapped the woman who owned the room. The dinner had been James's victory lap. That's what he called it to everyone except Margaret. To her, he described it as a necessary obligation and asked her to come because investors find spouses reassuring. He said this while standing at their bathroom mirror, adjusting a cufflink she had given him on their 4th anniversary. He didn't thank her. He rarely thanked her for anything that made his life easier anymore. Margaret had watched him through the reflection. At 43, James Calloway still knew how to look like success. His hair had gone silver at the temples in a way that read as authority. His suit suggested discipline without announcing it. His smile could make a boardroom feel handpicked. That smile had once worked on Margaret too, back when hunger looked like drive instead of appetite. "Will Diane be there?" she had asked. The cufflink paused between his fingers. "She organized the event." "That wasn't my question." His expression sharpened, then smoothed. "Don't start tonight." There it was, the old trick. He turned every question into an accusation before it could become evidence. Margaret picked up her earrings from the vanity. "I asked whether your assistant will be present at a dinner where my family office is being asked to extend bridge financing." "It's not your family office." "No." He looked at her in the mirror. For 1 second, something cautious moved through his eyes, then pride buried it. "You know what I mean. Calloway Trust is managed by professionals. You don't sit there with a crown deciding who gets to eat. Margaret slipped one diamond into her ear. I read the reports, crowns are inefficient. He gave a short, humorless laugh. This is exactly why I need you calm tonight. These are serious people. Serious people. They don't need your little observations. She'd heard that phrase in so many different jackets. Little question, little concern, little misunderstanding. Every time James needed her to make herself smaller, he made her judgment sound like an accessory. She looked at him directly. Do you need your wife there or do you need a prop? His jaw tightened. I need one evening without friction. Then stop generating it. Diane knows how these things run. If you're unsure about something, follow her lead. That specific sentence was when Margaret understood he hadn't simply grown careless with Diane. He had become comfortable letting Diane manage his wife. She said nothing. James mistook that for agreement. Men like him always did. Diane Foster had joined James's company as an executive assistant and socially promoted herself within 6 months. She learned his calendar first, then his moods, then his pressure points. By her first anniversary at the company, she could anticipate his needs before he named them. Dark roast before board calls, a specific bourbon after bad press cycles, a hotel room facing east because he liked sunrise photos for his investor newsletters. She laughed at his sharpest observations and looked wounded when he thanked her too casually. James called her irreplaceable. Margaret called that the first warning sign. Irreplaceable employees were real. Irreplaceable assistants who started selecting a CEO's ties, screening his wife's phone calls, and sitting beside him at restricted dinners were something else entirely. Diane was beautiful in a very deliberate way, blonde highlights, calculated warmth, and a talent for turning service into proximity. She called Margaret Mrs. Calloway in public and Margaret in private, as if familiarity were a thing she'd stolen and intended to display openly. The first correction had been over flowers. James prefers white lilies at formal events, Diane said, removing the garden roses Margaret had chosen for a dinner at their own home. Roses red as personal, it can distract from the tone. Margaret had looked at her steadily. This is my dining room. Of course, I only meant he'll feel more comfortable. That was Diane's gift. She disguised intrusion as devotion to James. The second time, Diane interrupted a vendor conversation Margaret was having for her foundation's annual luncheon. James asked that all supplier decisions for shared events route through me, Diane said smoothly. This isn't a shared event. He thought you'd understand. Margaret understood perfectly. Diane was testing walls, James was watching her do it, and if Margaret responded too early, too loudly, too visibly, James would reach for his favorite word. Jealous. So Margaret did what she had spent years learning inside private capital work. She documented, she kept dates, she watched the pattern accumulate until it revealed its worth. It did. Diane's name started appearing on expense approvals outside her job description, upgraded travel on investor accounts, personal styling billed to corporate events, a retainer paid to a consulting firm owned by Diane's college roommate, a keycard with building access broader than any assistant needed, flowers charged to corporate accounts and delivered to an apartment in Chicago on nights James claimed to be in Washington. Margaret didn't confront him immediately. Confrontation without leverage only gives liars rehearsal time. Instead, she quietly asked Callaway Trust to commission a governance review of Pinnacle Bridge Holdings, James's company. Not because she wanted to dismantle him. At first, she still hoped the truth would be smaller than the dread. It wasn't. By the night of the dinner, Margaret already knew enough to end the marriage. What she hadn't expected was Diane's hand across her face. The dinner was held at Vellum, a restaurant in downtown Chicago so private that people with drivers still pretended to have stumbled upon it. The reserved dining room sat high above the city, wrapped in glass on 2 sides. Below, lakeshore traffic threaded through the winter dark in red and white lines. Inside, the table had been dressed in cream linen, low candles and arrangements Diane had personally selected. White lilies. Margaret noticed, almost smiled. Predictable people were useful. They left fingerprints in aesthetics the same way they left them on spreadsheets. James greeted guests at the entrance with the warmth he performed so effortlessly. He touched shoulders, remembered names of adult children, and moved through the room with the controlled urgency of a man orbiting a deal. Pinnacle Bridge was acquiring a struggling logistics platform called North Star Systems. The acquisition required bridge financing, and that financing depended on confidence from Callaway Trust's partner network. Most people in that room believed James had brought Margaret because her family name still unlocked old doors. Only 3 people knew that Margaret didn't just carry the name. She chaired the investment committee that could close or collapse the deal before sunrise. James knew, his CFO David Rees knew, and Margaret's personal attorney Christine Walsh, seated 2 rooms away in the main restaurant as if entirely by coincidence, knew. Diane did not. That ignorance made her bold. She moved through the room in red silk like someone staking territory, touching James's sleeve, leaning toward his ear, angling herself between Margaret and the investors twice during the cocktail hour. She rearranged the place cards once, sliding Margaret 3 seats farther from James and placing herself directly at his right. Margaret watched it happen. James watched it happen. He did nothing. At 8:15, Diane appeared behind Margaret's chair. "You're in Scott Henderson's seat." Margaret looked at the card in front of her, her own name. "I'm not." Diane's smile held, her eyes didn't. "James needs Scott close for the financing conversation, you understand." "Then James can ask me." "James asked me to handle the seating. And I'm handling my chair." Diane's fingers tightened on the chair back. "Please don't embarrass him tonight." There it was, the sentence women like Diane borrowed from men like James. Don't embarrass him. As if Margaret's refusal to move was the most dangerous thing in the room. She placed her napkin in her lap. "You can return to your seat now." Diane stared for one long beat, then she walked away smiling. Margaret recognized that smile. It meant escalation had been chosen. The first course arrived under pressure, so carefully polished it almost looked like elegance. James gave a short welcome about vision, timing, and execution. Investors lifted glasses. Directors nodded. Diane sat at his right with a tablet near her plate, though no one else had brought a device to the table. Margaret sat 3 seats away, listening without visible expression. She had once loved James's speeches. Early on, his ambition had felt like motion. He talked about companies like engines, markets like weather, people like bridges. He could make calculated risk sound almost moral. Margaret had believed in him because she could see not only what he wanted to build but what he lacked: patience, capital discipline, someone who would tell him no before the market did. She became that person. Then he began resenting her for it. The soup arrived. Diane leaned toward Scott Henderson and said, "James has been carrying this entire deal almost alone. Not everyone at home understands what real leadership costs." Light enough to pass as conversation, aimed like a dart. Scott glanced at Margaret, uncomfortable. "I imagine it puts pressure on any family." Diane smiled sympathetically. "Some families understand it better than others." James looked down at his soup. That was the part that hurt the most, not Diane's words, James's silence. A stranger could be cruel, an assistant could be ambitious, but a husband who let another woman diminish his wife at his own table was making a deliberate choice. Margaret set down her spoon. "Diane," she said, voice even, "when you say not everyone at home, are you referring to me?" The table stilled. Diane blinked. "I was speaking generally." "Then speak generally with better manners." A soft exhale escaped someone near the far end of the table, almost a laugh. Diane heard it, her face flushed under the foundation. James's eyes snapped to Margaret with a look she'd seen before, a warning. She met it without moving. Diane lifted her wine glass, set it down too hard. "Some of us actually earn our seats at tables like this. This isn't a charity luncheon where everyone applauds because your family name is printed on the program." Margaret tilted her head. "You're explaining professional credibility to me." "Someone should," James murmured. "It wasn't a reprimand, it was worse. It was management, not stop disrespecting my wife. Maury like careful, not here." Diane heard the weakness in it and mistook it for permission. She stood up. "I'm tired," she said, voice rising, "of watching people disrespect everything James has built. Some of us actually belong at this table." Then she walked around the chairs and slapped Margaret across the face. After Margaret slapped Diane back, the room divided into 3 categories of people. Those stunned that a wife had been struck, those stunned that she had struck back, and those who were suddenly, very quietly, looking at James and wondering what he knew that made him look terrified rather than furious. Scott Henderson spoke first. "James, what the hell is this?" James didn't answer him. He moved toward Margaret with both palms raised open, the gesture she had watched him use on difficult investors for a decade. Calm voice, soft hands, eyes trained on the problem. Tonight the problem wasn't Diane's violence. The problem was Margaret refusing to absorb it. "Margaret," his voice was low, "we can handle this privately." She looked at Diane, whose cheek had begun darkening behind her palm. "She made it public. She lost control." "So did you, by your definition." He swallowed. "That's not what That's what you protected." Diane's eyes flashed. "You embarrassed him all night." Margaret turned to face her fully for the first time. "Diane, you assaulted a guest at a formal investor dinner. You're his wife." "I'm also a guest, and a person, and apparently several other things you were never told." "You're acting like a victim." Margaret's voice cooled. "I'm acting like a witness." That word changed the temperature of the room. James heard it and went still. Witness meant documentation. Witness meant statements. Witness meant Margaret had stepped outside the private language of marriage where men renamed harm as friction. The restaurant manager arrived with 2 members of the security staff, summoned by the waiter who had retreated the moment Diane's arm swung. Christine Walsh appeared behind them, no longer performing coincidence. She wore a dark blazer, carried a leather folio, and looked at Diane with the patience of someone who had learned long ago to prefer evidence over outrage. "Mrs. Calloway," Christine said, "do you want to file an incident report?" Diane stared. "Who are you?" "Counsel." James's voice sharpened. "Christine, not now." Margaret almost smiled at that. James had forgotten the simplest rule of leverage. You can't command people who no longer work for your comfort. "Yes," Margaret said. "I want a report. I also want the restaurant to preserve all security footage from this room, the corridor and the front entrance." Diane's face shifted. James's shifted more. "Margaret," he whispered, "please." The word came out too late. The investors watched James beg his wife not to preserve evidence. That single moment did more damage than the slap ever could. Violence could be reframed. Sudden, emotional, a private disagreement that found the wrong room, but fear of footage made everyone at that table ask the same question at the same time. "What else is on it?" Margaret knew the answer. She'd seen Diane arrive with James through the private elevator, though James had told her he was coming directly from his office. She'd seen Diane adjust his collar near the bar, her hand staying longer than necessary. She'd watched James touch the small of Diane's back while laughing with Scott Henderson. Small moments, each explainable alone. Together they formed a language she had learned to read. But tonight's footage mattered for more than an affair. It placed Diane at a restricted financing dinner without any formal disclosure of her relationship to the CEO. It showed her attempting to manipulate seating for capital partners. It documented a physical assault. It recorded James actively working to minimize that assault in front of witnesses. A scandal was emotional. A governance failure was expensive. Christine spoke quietly to the restaurant manager. He nodded fast. Nobody wanted to be the establishment that mishandled footage of a billionaire's wife being struck at a private investor dinner. Diane stepped toward James. "Tell them this is insane." James didn't look at her. That was the moment Diane understood, not completely, but enough. Her access to him had depended entirely on rooms where Margaret stayed quiet. The moment Margaret started speaking in the language of legal consequence, Diane became a liability. "James," Diane said, softer now. He flinched. Margaret watched the flinch and felt something old inside the marriage turn to ash, not because he was afraid of losing Diane, because he was afraid of being seen choosing her. Scott Henderson stood. He was the kind of man whose family wealth was old enough that it no longer needed flattery. "I think we're finished here," he said. James turned fast. "Scott, this has nothing to do with the North Star acquisition." Scott looked at Diane, then at Margaret, then back at James. "You allowed your assistant to strike the chair of the investment committee whose approval you need, and you think that has nothing to do with judgment." The room seemed to tilt. Diane's lips parted. Several heads turned toward Margaret. James closed his eyes. There it was. No announcement, no trumpet. The secret entered through Scott Henderson's irritation and sat down at the table like it had always belonged there. Margaret Calloway was not merely James's wife. She was the chair. "Chair of what?" Diane whispered. No one answered immediately. That silence was its own education. Margaret set her napkin beside her plate, her cheek still strung, her palm still tingled from returning the slap. Her heartbeat was steady, not because she felt no anger, but because anger had finally found somewhere useful to go. Scott exhaled through his nose. "Calloway Private Investment Committee." Diane looked from Scott to James. "That's not real." James said nothing. "James," she said. Still nothing. David Reese, the CFO, leaned forward with the expression of a man watching a building settle. "Diane, stop talking." It was the only sensible sentence anyone from Pinnacle Bridge had spoken all night. Diane turned on him. "You knew." David looked miserable. "Everyone who needed to know knew." Her laugh came out fractured. "Everyone except me." Margaret looked at James. "That seems to be a pattern." James found his voice at last. "Margaret, this is not the place." "You're right," she said. "It shouldn't have needed a place." She looked toward Christine. Christine opened the folio and removed a single sheet. "Mrs. Calloway, Calloway Trust received the preliminary governance review this afternoon. Given tonight's incident, I'll be recommending immediate suspension of bridge financing pending a full board review." James's voice hardened. "You can't do that over a personal dispute." Margaret looked at him. "You think this isn't personal enough?" His jaw set. "Don't be emotional." "All right, let's be technical." She kept her voice even. "Your executive assistant attended a restricted financing dinner with no formal disclosure of her personal relationship with you. She attempted to influence seating for capital partners. She assaulted the committee chair. You then discouraged evidence preservation in front of witnesses, and that's before we discuss the expense irregularities." Diane's eyes widened. "Expense irregularities?" James said tightly, "That's enough." "No," Margaret said, "that word belongs to me now." The room watched them both. James had expected a wife he could quiet. He had found a creditor holding a marriage license. Margaret picked up the incident report from the restaurant manager and signed it. Her handwriting didn't shake. "Christine," she said, "notify Calloway Trust that I'm recusing from any vote involving personal settlement matters, but I'm requesting an emergency review of Pinnacle Bridge's financing based on independent governance concerns." Christine nodded. "Already drafted." For the first time that night, something close to quiet satisfaction moved across Margaret's face. James saw it. It frightened him more than fury would have. Diane was escorted from the restaurant through the side corridor. She tried composure first. Shoulders back, chin up, the red dress catching the track lighting. That lasted until she spotted the security camera mounted above the service elevator and realized the building had been watching from angles the dining room couldn't cover. "I need my coat," she said. Donna, the restaurant's security manager, kept walking. "It'll be brought out." "I'm not being treated like I did something criminal." "You struck a guest in my dining room." "She hit me back." "After you hit her first." "She provoked me." "With conversation." The server nearby studied his shoes with great intensity, hiding a smile. Diane's humiliation curdled into panic. The elevator opened. 2 members of Pinnacle Bridge's corporate security waited inside with the practiced blankness of people who had been told to collect a problem. She turned back toward the corridor. "I need to speak to James." "Mr. Calloway is occupied." "He'll want me there." Nobody answered. That was how Diane learned the brutal arithmetic of proximity. Being close to power was not the same as having it. She had mistaken James's desire for his protection, his access for his loyalty, his whispers for his commitment. The moment she became costly, he stayed in the room. Back inside, James was trying to save the deal. "Scott," he said, "you know my operational record." Scott had not retaken his seat. "I know enough to want distance." "From me." "From instability." James turned to the remaining investors. "Are we seriously going to let a dinner argument define company value?" Margaret answered before anyone else could. "Company value includes leadership judgment." "You don't run my company." "No, I evaluate whether Callaway Trust should continue financing it." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "There she is." Margaret looked at him. Yes. The simplicity of it took the insult back from him entirely. James's expression flickered. For years he had treated Margaret's competence like something he tolerated in private and concealed in public. Now it stood in a Chicago dining room under recessed lighting, witnessed by every person he'd wanted to impress. He hated it, he needed it. That was the beginning of his unraveling. The first call from Pinnacle Bridge's board arrived before dessert would have been served. James stepped into the corridor with David Reese, leaving Margaret in the dining room with Christine and the investors, who hadn't yet made their excuses and left. The hallway was lined with dark glass panels that reflected James back at himself from every angle. He looked at each reflection, disliked them all. "Board chair," David said. James answered. "James," said Patricia Hobbs, the board chair, her voice carrying the particular calm of someone who had already been briefed. "Tell me the report I just received is exaggerated." He pressed 2 fingers to his temple. "There was an incident. Your assistant struck Margaret Callaway at a financing dinner. She reacted to provocation." David closed his eyes. Patricia's silence was harder than anything she could have said. "Do you hear yourself?" she asked. "Patricia, I need you focused. The North Star acquisition can't be held up because my wife and Diane had a confrontation." "A confrontation? Your assistant struck the chair of a financing committee in front of your investors." "Margaret is my wife. That doesn't make her less chair." The words landed because they came from Patricia, not Margaret. James had spent years separating Margaret's roles into separate boxes: wife, family donor, social asset, quiet advisor. He opened whichever box was useful and locked the others when they threatened him. Tonight every box had opened at once. Patricia continued. "The board convenes at 7 a.m. You will preserve all communications involving Diane Foster, Callaway Trust, North Star Systems, and any expense authorizations related to tonight's dinner." "That's not necessary." "It's mandatory." "You're responding to optics." "I'm responding to risk, James." The call ended. James lowered the phone. David spoke carefully. "We need to get out ahead of this. Don't start with crisis framing. This is a crisis. It's a dinner. It's a dinner where your assistant assaulted your wife and exposed a governance review in front of your investors. Whose side are you on?" David looked exhausted. "The company's, that used to be the same thing." James stared at him. Then Margaret's voice came from behind them both. "That's the problem with making yourself the company. Eventually, people have to decide which one they're saving." James turned. She stood at the corridor entrance, Christine beside her, the restaurant manager behind them both holding a copy of the incident report. Her cheek had reddened. She hadn't tried to cover it. The mark was there, visible, and so was the fact that she was standing with her spine straight. James tried to drive Margaret home. He approached her on the sidewalk outside Vellum while black cars lined the curb and January air sharpened every edge. Investors disappeared in quiet clusters. Scott Henderson paused to press a kiss to Margaret's undamaged cheek and say, "Don't let him make this small." James heard it. His jaw tightened. "My car's here," James said. Margaret buttoned her coat. "So is mine. We're still married." "That's a legal fact, not a travel arrangement." Christine coughed softly into her fist, possibly to conceal amusement. James stepped closer. Margaret, please, we need to talk without all of this. She looked at him with something close to sorrow. James, you had years, don't call accountability theatrical. Clara was wrong. Diane, Margaret said quietly. He blinked. What? Her name is Diane, you've already started distancing. He flushed. I'll handle her. No, you won't. You don't get to handle a woman you spent months empowering to manage me. The company can address her employment. The restaurant will handle the incident report. My attorney handles the legal record. I handle myself. James looked around. The doorman was staring straight ahead with heroic discipline. Drivers pretended not to watch. You're enjoying this, he said low. Her eyes changed. No, she said. I enjoyed the early years of our marriage before you started treating my patients like an unlimited account. I enjoyed building something with the man I believed you were. I enjoyed watching your company survive the years when no bank would touch your debt. Tonight isn't enjoyment. Tonight is the balance coming due. For once, James had no response assembled. Her car pulled up, a dark sedan driven by a security driver James had never seen before. That detail unsettled him. He had believed he understood the scope of Margaret's life. Her wardrobe, her committees, her family estate in Connecticut, her quiet office downtown. He had forgotten that private wasn't the same as small. Before she got in, James said, if you freeze the financing, thousands of employees could suffer. She paused. There it was, the hostage argument. He'd used softer versions before. The company needs this. People are depending on us. You can't challenge me without hurting innocent people. Margaret turned back. Then let's make sure it's the person creating the risk who pays for it, not the employees. James went still. She got in the car. The door closed with the soft, definitive sound of something that costs a great deal and requires no apology. Diane called James 41 times that night. He answered on the 42nd. Where are you? She demanded. James stood in his office with the lights off, looking at the city through the floor-to-ceiling glass. The building was mostly empty. His own reflection looked like someone wearing his face. Don't use this number for this. Silence then. Excuse me. Call through counsel. Diane laughed in disbelief. You want me to get a lawyer to talk to you? You need one. James, I hit her because she was humiliating you all night. You assaulted a capital partner. She's your wife. She's also Callaway Trust. You lied to me. The accusation strung because it was accurate, and because she sounded more offended by the deception than by what she'd done with it. I didn't discuss Margaret's role in the trust because it was confidential. You let me sit in that room thinking I had standing. You let me believe she was. Stop. You told me she was nothing without the family name. Diane's voice shook. You said she didn't understand real business. You said she only cared about how things looked. You said she'd never push back because she was trained to behave. James's hand tightened around the phone. You told me she was a ceremonial signature, Diane continued. You said that more than once. Diane, are you afraid I recorded you? He didn't answer fast enough. She laughed, but the sound fractured in the middle. You are God. Listen to me. No, you listen. I lost my career tonight because you let me believe I had a future beside you. You moved every line I thought was fixed, and now I'm the one standing in a hallway. He had nothing. I crossed lines, Diane said, but you built the map. The line went dead. James stared at the dark screen. For the first time that night, he understood the full dimension of his problem. Diane wasn't just an affair. She was a witness with motive, a bruised ego, and access to months of messages. She had learned from him exactly how private damage could become public leverage. Margaret drove to the house she had owned before James. She'd kept it through the marriage because her grandmother had taught her, firmly and without sentimentality, that every woman needed a door only she could lock. James had always disliked the house. Too old, he said, too quiet, no view. Margaret called it paid for. Rosa, who had managed her household for 18 years, opened the door before Margaret reached the top step. Her eyes went directly to the reddened cheek. I'm all right, Margaret said. That's not what I asked. Margaret almost smiled. Rosa had long since earned the right to skip polite lies. "It hurts," Margaret said. "Good, pain tells the truth. Come inside." Within minutes, Margaret was at the kitchen island with a cold compress against her face, while Rosa made coffee strong enough to broker a treaty. Christine sat across from her reviewing messages. Elias Barrett, her family office director, joined by secure video from their New York office, where he'd been waiting. "I have the preliminary board package," he said. "The governance review is worse than the initial read." Margaret closed her eyes for one breath. Summary. Diane's compensation was adjusted 3 times without committee review. Corporate travel accounts used for personal trips. A consulting retainer tied to her college roommate's agency. Private apartment costs reclassified as executive accommodation. There are also messages that suggest James was aware. Christine looked up. "Suggest." "Several are ambiguous." Margaret lowered the compress. "James writes ambiguously when he wants deniability." Elias nodded. "Then yes, he knew." The words settled over the kitchen. Rosa set the coffee down with slightly more force than necessary. "I never liked that man," she said. Christine blinked. Margaret looked at her. "You told me at the wedding you thought he was charming." "It was your wedding. I liked your dress." For the first time all night, Margaret laughed. It hurt where the slap had landed, but she let it happen anyway. Then she opened the folder Christine had brought. At the top was a still from the restaurant security camera. Diane's hand in the air, Margaret seated, James visible in the background. Watching, not moving. That image mattered more than the slap itself. The slap was Diane's act. James's stillness was the marriage. At 7 a.m., Pinnacle Bridge's board convened without pleasantries. James arrived 10 minutes early in the same suit from the night before, wearing the expression of a man planning to call exhaustion a strategy. David Reese sat near the far end with eyes that hadn't slept. Patricia Hobbs presided at the head. 2 independent directors joined by video. Legal counsel lined the side wall. Margaret joined by video as well. James hated that specifically, not because remote attendance was unusual, because she appeared in a quiet, composed office, her hair smooth, the bruise on her cheek visible in the camera light. That visible mark made everything he'd prepared to say sound worse before he opened his mouth. Patricia began. "This emergency session addresses the incident at Vellum, the Callaway Trust governance review, and related conduct involving Diane Foster." James leaned forward. "Before we start, I want to state clearly that last night's events were deeply regrettable." Margaret's face didn't move. Patricia asked, "What specifically are you regretting?" "The disruption." David looked at the table. One director rubbed his forehead. Patricia's voice cooled by several degrees. "Try again." James's jaw worked. "I regret that Diane struck Margaret. And that I didn't intervene sooner." Margaret spoke for the first time. "You didn't intervene at all." James looked at the screen. "I was trying not to escalate the situation." "You escalated it by asking me not to preserve footage, in front of witnesses." The room shifted. Patricia looked at legal. Counsel made a note. James pivoted. "This company cannot allow a marital dispute to hold a major acquisition hostage. The financing suspension is completely disproportionate." Margaret answered evenly. "Callaway Trust didn't pause financing because I'm your wife. We paused because Pinnacle Bridge failed to disclose executive misconduct, assistant overreach, expense irregularities, and unauthorized access to confidential investor materials. Those are allegations. They're documented in a preliminary review your own financing agreement authorizes." Patricia cut in. "James, did you authorize Diane Foster to attend restricted financing discussions?" "She manages my calendar." "That's not an answer." "She was there in a support capacity." David Reese's voice came from the far end of the table, quieter than expected. "She was seated as a principal guest, and she was given pre-dinner briefing materials." He paused. "I objected by email 3 times." Patricia looked up sharply. "You documented your objections?" "Yes." James stared at him. Margaret didn't look surprised. That was when James understood she had already read the emails. The board asked James to step out for executive session. He refused at first, then legal counsel reminded him the refusal would be entered into the record. That moved him. He walked into the outer corridor where Pinnacle Bridge's history lined the walls in frames. Founding year, first major contract, Series A close, the Chicago expansion, photographs of ribbon cuttings, award ceremonies, and smiling men in suits. James stood beneath a photograph of himself at 34, younger, sharper-edged, shaking hands with a state senator who now pretended they'd met only once. Diane had once told him that photo made him look inevitable. Margaret had told him it made him look like he hadn't slept in a week. He had preferred Diane's version. Inside the conference room, Margaret laid out her conditions. She didn't ask for spectacle, she asked for structure. Immediate suspension of Diane Foster pending investigation, preservation of all relevant communications, an independent review of executive expenses, temporary restrictions on James's unilateral spending authority, a special oversight committee for the North Star acquisition, employee protections if financing terms changed, full disclosure of personal relationships affecting company governance. One outside director, Franklin Gray, frowned. "This is extensive." Margaret nodded. "It's also considerably less than withdrawal." David said quietly, "She's right." Franklin looked at him. "You're supporting this." David looked at the door behind which James waited. "I'm supporting the company surviving its founder." The sentence landed like something dropped from a height. Patricia studied him. "You understand what you're saying?" "Yes." Margaret watched David carefully. He had covered for James in small ways for years, the way many CFOs learn to cover for difficult founders. Tonight he looked like a man who had reached the outermost limit of his own self-justification. Patricia called James back in. He entered with a face composed for patience. She read him the conditions. With each one his expression tightened. "You're handing my company to my wife," he said. Margaret's voice stayed quiet. "We're removing your ability to use the company as a personal shield." He laughed once hollow. "You planned this." "No," she said, "I waited for you to stop." The room went still. That sentence didn't sound like strategy. It sounded like the truth underneath the strategy, and everyone in the room heard the difference. Diane was suspended by noon. The company email was brief and legally careful. Administrative leave effective immediately. All employees directed to preserve communications. Inquiries routed to legal. The message didn't mention the slap. It didn't need to. Every employee had heard about it before 10 a.m. because companies always have invisible hallways where the truth moves faster than policy. Diane got the email in her apartment, the one James had arranged through corporate accounts. She'd furnished it as if permanence could be manufactured. Cream sofa, warm lamp glow, framed black and white prints of cities she'd wanted James to take her to. Her company laptop locked remotely while she was reading the email. She called James, no answer, called again, still nothing. Then she called David Reese. He answered with counsel on the line. "Diane, I can't discuss the investigation without legal present." "Investigation," her voice went brittle. "I ran his entire life, his calendar, his travel, his investor relationships. That's part of the concern. Don't condescend to me. You sent me those briefing packets." David closed his eyes, at James's direction. "Then say that." A pause. "I intend to." The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. This one had fear in it. "He's going to blame me," Diane said. David didn't answer. "David, get an attorney." She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that isn't really a laugh. "That bad?" "Yes." After the call, Diane sat on the cream sofa and stared at the locked screen. James had told her Margaret was ornamental, that old money women in Margaret's position preferred invisibility because visibility seemed common. He told Diane she understood him in ways Margaret never would. Now she understood something else entirely. James described women according to what he needed them to provide. Margaret had been boring when he needed Diane to feel chosen. Diane had become a liability the moment he needed the board to see distance. The names changed, the use stayed the same. She opened a drawer and pulled out the phone she'd kept for private messages only. Unlike the laptop, it still worked. There were voice notes, there were photos, there were instructions in James's own words. Diane stared at the screen until the tears arrived, whether she wanted them or not. Then she called an attorney. Margaret didn't go to James's house. That distinction mattered because for 9 years everyone had called it their house, even though her trust had purchased it, even though her grandmother's architect had supervised the restoration, even though James had filled it with furniture too angular and expensive to sit in comfortably. After the board meeting, he texted once, "We need to talk, come home." She replied, "That house is not available for crisis management." He didn't respond. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Margaret met with a divorce attorney. Not only because of the slap. People outside a marriage always wanted one definitive moment, something dramatic enough to justify the ending. A slap made a clean explanation. But the real story was quieter. It was James letting Diane rearrange her seating, James letting Diane correct her at dinner parties, James calling her paranoid when she asked for clarity, James using his employees as leverage every time she questioned a financial decision, James standing still while another woman's hand crossed her face. The attorney was a measured woman named Sandra Holt, who listened without interruption and took notes without visible reaction. "Do you want fault grounds?" Sandra asked. "I want leverage, not theatre." Sandra almost smiled. "Theatre runs expensive." Margaret placed a folder on the conference table. Prenuptial agreement, trust structure, separate property schedule, corporate exposure memo, the incident report from the previous night. Sandra opened the folder, paused and looked up. "You came prepared." "I came married to James." That required no further explanation. The prenup was airtight. James had signed it when he still believed her family wealth was passive, inherited furniture and old zip codes. He'd focused entirely on protecting his founder equity. He hadn't understood that Margaret's most valuable assets weren't real estate or heirlooms. They were control structures, governance rights, and debt instruments tied directly to his company's survival. "He may claim coercion," Sandra said. "He had 4 attorneys at signing." "He may claim you used your marital position to influence the company review." The review was authorized under the financing agreement and initiated before the assault. "He may claim emotional retaliation." Margaret looked at the window. "He can argue feelings, we'll answer with dates." Sandra nodded once approvingly. "What do you want at the end?" she asked. Margaret had expected the question and still found it hard. She didn't want James humiliated on every platform. She didn't want Diane destroyed publicly. She didn't want a mansion she'd already owned, or applause from strangers, or the grim satisfaction of watching people who'd underestimated her walk it back. She wanted the sentence that had taken shape in her kitchen at midnight, staring at a security still. "I want to stop financing my own humiliation," she said. Sandra closed the folder gently. "That," she said, "we can do." James arrived at Margaret's townhouse at dusk. Rosa did not let him in. He stood on the front steps under a grey umbrella, rain pulling at the edges. He looked expensive, tired, and unfamiliar with the concept of a locked door not opening for him. Rosa stood visible through the glass panel beside the door, arms folded, expression blank, in the particular way of someone who has outlasted wealthier men than him. "I'm her husband," James said. "She knows." "Then open the door." She said no. "Rosa, this is completely—" "Many things are." He stared at her. She stared back with the patience of someone who had made her own decisions about character a long time ago and saw no reason to revise them. James stepped back and called Margaret. She answered on the 5th ring. "I'm outside," he said. "I know. You're really going to make me stand in the rain?" "I'm not making you do anything. You came without being invited. The weather made the rest of the decision." His breathing shifted. "We are still married." "You mentioned that last night." "Because it matters." "It mattered less when Diane hit me and you asked me not to document it." A long pause. Rain moved across the umbrella. "Yes," he said finally, "I was afraid." The honesty surprised them both. Margaret didn't soften. Of what? Of the deal, the financing, what it would mean for the acquisition. A beat. Not of losing me, she said. He didn't answer quickly enough. James, she said quietly, I know. I didn't mean. You meant it, you just didn't plan on saying it clearly. Silence stretched across the line. Rain tapped the umbrella. I made mistakes with Diane, he said finally. Mistakes are scheduling errors. Diane had an apartment paid through corporate accounts for 7 months. I can explain. To the auditors, to the board. Margaret. To my divorce attorney. He went completely still. Inside, through the glass, Rosa watched the word land on him. Divorce, not threat, not positioning, a door opening beneath his feet. You're not serious, he said. Margaret looked around her study. The bookshelves lined with volumes James had never opened, the art he'd called severe. The room felt more genuinely hers than it had in years. I have never been less theatrical in my life, she said. She ended the call. Rosa watched James lower the phone. He didn't knock again. The footage leaked at 8:20 that evening. Not the full restaurant recording. Just 11 seconds captured by someone at the far end of the table on a phone angled low. Diane's arm rising through candlelight, the sound of the slap, Margaret turning her face back, Diane's voice, nobody raised you right. Then Margaret rising. The clip ended before Margaret struck back. That mattered enormously. By 8:45 the internet had written a story. CEO's wife causes scene, disrespects staff, gets what she deserves, sympathetic angles on Diane, questions about Margaret's entitlement. Nobody mentioned what came before it. James's communications team issued no correction. That mattered more than the clip. Margaret's communications director, Tanya Brown, called from a car. Do you want to respond? Margaret sat in her study with tea going cold. Not yet. They cut it before your response. They're framing Diane as staff defending James. I noticed. We can push the full footage. Margaret looked at rain crossing the window. The old version of her would have waited for James to set the record straight, would have called and asked very carefully, very reasonably, why his team was letting strangers make her the villain. She was finished asking people to stop benefiting from her silence. Give them an hour, Margaret said. For what? For Pinnacle Bridge to put out an accurate statement. And if they don't? Release the full sequence, clean timestamps, no captions. At 9:05, Pinnacle Bridge issued a statement. Regret regarding a private disagreement taken out of context. Private disagreement. Margaret forwarded it to Tanya with one word, now. At 9:17, the full footage appeared through Margaret's legal communications account. No music, no graphic overlays, no emotional framing. Just the room, the table, Diane provoking, James watching, Diane striking, Margaret returning it, James panicking, Margaret requesting footage preservation, Christine arriving. Just the truth in sequence with timestamps. The public turned in under an hour. Private disagreement became a punchline by 10. By 10:30, investors were asking publicly why Pinnacle Bridge had tried to minimize an assault. By 11, Diane's name was appearing alongside the phrase expense irregularities. By midnight, James sent one message. You could have warned me. Margaret looked at it for a moment, then she typed back. I did for years. Diane's attorney contacted Christine the next morning. By noon there was a meeting. Margaret didn't attend in person. She watched through a secure video feed from her office, the same way she watched acquisition presentations when she wanted to observe who performed honesty rather than practiced it. Diane arrived in the conference room without the red dress, without the borrowed glamour. Dark blazer plain, her hair down and simple. Without James's reflected authority, she looked younger and far less certain. Christine began, Ms. Foster, you requested this meeting. Diane's attorney nodded. My client is prepared to cooperate with the governance review. In exchange for favorable consideration of potential claims. Christine's expression remained precise. We're listening. Diane swallowed. James told me Margaret was only on the trust as a courtesy. Margaret didn't move. He said she didn't make real decisions, Diane continued. He called her sheltered. He said people deferred to her because of the family name. He said she'd never had to earn anything. Christine asked, did he direct you to attend restricted financing discussions? Yes. Did you receive investor materials? Yes. From whom? James forwarded some directly. David sent others after James told him to include me. Did you understand them to be confidential? Diane's eyes moved to her attorney. I understood James wanted me to have them. Christine's pen paused. Those aren't the same thing. I know that now. The questioning continued methodically. The apartment, the travel, the seating changes, the voice notes, the receipts. Diane had kept more than Margaret had expected, not from strategy but from insecurity. She had wanted documentation that James chose her. Those documents had become a map of misconduct. Then Christine asked the question Margaret had been waiting for. Before you struck Mrs. Calloway, had James ever encouraged you to confront her? Diane looked down. Her attorney touched her wrist. Diane said, he told me someone needed to remind her that business dinners weren't charity events. Margaret closed her eyes. Not an order, not enough to make James legally responsible for Diane's hand, but enough to reveal the environment he had built, deliberately, around his own wife. Christine's voice stayed level. When did he say that? In the car, on the way to the restaurant. Was anyone else present? The driver. Margaret opened her eyes. Christine glanced toward the camera just briefly. Margaret understood immediately. Find the driver. The driver remembered everything. His name was Marcus Webb, 12 years with the same car service, long enough to understand that wealthy passengers often forgot that drivers had ears because they'd stopped thinking of drivers as people. He arrived at Christine's office in a collared shirt with a small notebook he'd carried out of habit. He'd started keeping notes after a difficult client accused him of taking a wrong route several years ago. Christine obtained consent for recording. What did you hear in the car? She asked. Marcus looked steady but careful. Mr. Calloway and Ms. Foster were arguing about Mrs. Calloway attending the dinner. What did Mr. Calloway say? Marcus glanced at the table. He said she needed to remember the evening wasn't one of her little charity events. Margaret listened from the adjoining room. Little charity events. The foundation she'd built over 11 years had funded pediatric trauma units, emergency legal clinics for families, and crisis housing for women escaping violence. James had praised her work at every public function where the donation reflected well on him. He had taken the microphone at 3 separate galas and thanked the room for supporting their family's philanthropic legacy, as if the work had been a shared effort. In the car on the way to dinner, it was a little charity event. Marcus continued. Ms. Foster said Mrs. Calloway always acted like she was above everyone. Mr. Calloway said nobody had ever pushed back with her properly. Christine asked those exact words. Yes, ma'am, pushed back properly. And then Marcus paused. He said if Mrs. Calloway made things awkward, Ms. Foster should handle it, because he couldn't afford a scene from his end. The silence that followed had weight. Did Ms. Foster respond? She said with pleasure. After Marcus left, Christine came into the adjoining room. It doesn't create direct legal liability for the assault, she said. I know, but it establishes pattern and intent. Yes. Christine studied Margaret. Are you all right? Margaret looked at the notes in front of her. James hadn't simply failed to defend her the night of the dinner. He had discussed her management in a car on the way there. He had assigned her handling to another woman before dessert was even ordered. The pain arrived quietly, not loud or dramatic, a cold inward folding. I will be, Margaret said. Christine accepted the answer as a promise, not a current state. James was suspended 4 days later. The board called it temporary executive leave pending review. The financial press called it a stunning reversal for one of Chicago's most prominent founders. Employees called it overdue. In private messages they immediately deleted. Pinnacle Bridges stock dropped. and then steadied after Callaway Trust announced conditional support for interim leadership and full employee protection. James watched the announcement from his office, with corporate security waiting nearby to collect his devices. He didn't rage, that would have been easier to dismiss. He sat behind the enormous desk he'd had built specifically for this room, too wide for the space, always had been, and looked at Patricia Hobbs as she read the board decision aloud. "You can't operate this company without me," he said. Patricia looked tired in a specific way that had nothing to do with sleep. "We're about to find out." David Rees stood near the window. He'd been named interim CEO that morning. He looked genuinely sick with nerves, but steadier than James had expected. James looked at him. "You wanted this." David's jaw tightened. "I wanted clean books and a CEO who treated warnings like information instead of disloyalty. I gave you your entire career. You also asked me to bury invoices twice." Patricia set down the folder. "Enough." Security collected James's company phone, his laptop, his badge, and his executive keycard. Each item placed in a clear evidence bag made a sound too small for what it represented. When the badge was taken, something in James's chest pulled hard, not because of the plastic card, because doors had been opening for him automatically for 15 years. Conference rooms, private elevators, club dining rooms, the corner suites in hotels, Evelyn's, Margaret's, Patience. He had confused access with identity. Now a security officer walked him to the elevator like any other former employee. In the lobby, people found reasons not to make eye contact. James saw his reflection in the glass doors as he walked out. For the first time in years, there was no company logo behind him, no assistant at his shoulder, no wife beside him, no room waiting for his approval. Just a man on a Chicago sidewalk in January. His personal phone buzzed. "Diane." He declined. Then he looked up and saw Margaret on the opposite side of the street, stepping out of a car with Christine. She didn't look at him. That hurt more than anything else that had happened in 4 days. Margaret entered Pinnacle Bridge through the front doors because the board invited her. She hadn't come to celebrate James's suspension. She'd come to protect the employees from the consequences of a founder who had confused himself with the institution. The lobby was colder than she remembered, all steel and polished concrete and curated confidence. James had redesigned it after the company crossed its first billion-dollar valuation. Margaret had suggested warmer materials. He told her the space needed to project authority. Now it projected anxiety. Employees watched discreetly through glass walls. Some had seen the footage. Some had heard the board news. Some only knew that the woman their CEO had once described as private had arrived with counsel on the same morning his building access stopped working. David met her in the elevator lobby. "Thank you for coming." He looked like someone who hadn't fully slept. "How bad is the actual financial state?" Tighter than James disclosed. "The North Star acquisition still makes sense if bridge financing holds and we cut the secondary agreements." "Show me those agreements." He handed her a folder. She read quickly. Vendor overpayments, image consulting, luxury retreats, executive accommodations tied to Diane, a PR retainer paid to the firm that had helped draft the misleading statement after the slap. He used company funds to manage the optics of an assault that happened at a company dinner, Margaret said. David's face colored. "Yes." "Did you authorize any of this?" "No, James ran it through discretionary spending authority." "That authority is suspended." "I know." They walked into the executive conference room. Department heads waited with the careful stillness of people braced for layoffs or subpoenas or both. Margaret didn't sit at the head of the table. She sat along the side, opened the folder and started working. "Callaway Trust's position is straightforward," she said. "We will not withdraw financing if Pinnacle Bridge meets its governance conditions, fully protects rank-and-file employees, and cooperates with the independent review. No one in this room will face consequences for telling the truth. No executive bonuses will be paid before employee retention is secured. No legal fees for James Callaway or Diane Foster will be charged to the company unless required by contract and approved by outside counsel." The head of operations exhaled audibly. Margaret looked around the table. Questions. A young legal director raised her hand. What happens if James sues? Margaret's expression didn't change. He'll discover that documents have page numbers. No one laughed loudly, but several people looked less afraid, and in a room that had spent 4 days operating on fear, that was a start. The divorce petition was filed on a Friday morning. James learned about it from his attorney, not from Margaret. That bothered him in a way he couldn't have articulated without sounding like a man who believed he deserved courtesy after public humiliation. He read the filing in a quiet room at his lawyer's office. Irreconcilable breakdown of marriage, separate property schedule preserved, temporary exclusive use of marital residence requested, residence held in trust by petitioner, preservation of all financial communications, protective order regarding company documents. The language was measured, the effect was not. She wants the house, James said. His attorney, Richard Vance, reviewed the filing without looking up. The house appears to be held by her trust. We lived there for 9 years. That may affect personal property access, not ownership. I renovated the kitchen. The renovation costs were reimbursed by the trust. There's a schedule. James pushed the document to the side. Of course there's a schedule. Richard folded his hands. Margaret Calloway appears to have a schedule for most things. You admire her. I respect preparation. James looked toward the window. She planned this. The prenuptial agreement was drafted before the marriage. The trust structure predates you. The governance review was initiated before the dinner. The incident report came after. The incident report followed the incident, yes. She waited for me to fail. Richard's voice cooled slightly. Mr. Calloway, your assistant struck your wife after you told her to handle any embarrassment. There is no version of this story where the central problem is your wife's patience running out. James looked at the petition again. For a decade, Margaret had been a footnote in the story he told about himself. The quiet wife, the family name, the background. Now she was the author of the document ending it. Diane's deposition lasted 7 hours. She cried once, corrected herself twice, and ultimately told enough truth to become useful. Margaret didn't attend in person. That evening she read the transcript in her study at home, while rain moved against the windows. Question: Did Mr. Calloway characterize Mrs. Calloway as uninvolved in Calloway Trust decisions? Answer: Yes. Question: What words did he use? Answer: He called her a ceremonial signature. Margaret paused. Ceremonial signature. She looked at her own hand resting on the transcript. That hand had signed debt extensions that saved James's payroll. It had signed disaster relief grants after 2 major hurricanes. It had signed hospital funding, a pediatric wing campaign, scholarship programs, 3 acquisition approvals, and the divorce petition now moving through court. Ceremonial. She kept reading. Question: Did Mr. Calloway suggest you had authority over Mrs. Calloway at company events? Answer: He said she was difficult in rooms and that I should manage her. Question: Manage how? Answer: Seating, what conversations she joined. If she seemed upset, get her out before anyone noticed. If she asked pointed questions, redirect her. Margaret closed the transcript. She sat without moving for a moment. The humiliation hadn't been accidental. It had been organized. James hadn't simply drifted into disrespect over time. He had assigned it. Rosa came in with tea and found Margaret looking at the closed file. Bad, Rosa asked. Clear. Sometimes clear is harder. Margaret nodded. Rosa set down the tray. She stood for a moment in the kitchen light. Your grandmother used to say, Rosa began, that a man who needs a woman managed is usually afraid she'll say the one sentence he can't answer. Margaret smiled faintly. She said a lot of useful things. She married poorly once, before your grandfather. Margaret looked up. I didn't know that. Rosa's face was steady. She never talked about it, but she left you this house, and she left you the trust structure that James never understood. Margaret looked down at the closed transcript. Maybe inheritance wasn't only money. Maybe it was also a warning passed forward by women who had survived rooms no one recorded, left in the form of locked doors and careful paperwork and kitchens, where the truth could be spoken plainly. James tried apology when everything else failed. The letter arrived through counsel, which made it safer for him and more insulting for her. 2 pages, typed, signed by hand. Margaret read it once in Sandra's office. Margaret, I've had time to reflect on the pain caused by recent events. I deeply regret my role in allowing boundaries to blur and in not protecting you from an unacceptable moment. Our marriage deserves better than public conflict. I hope we can find a path toward reconciliation. She stopped there. Unacceptable moment, she said. Sandra looked over her glasses, noticed. Boundaries blurred, reconciliation. He's apologizing to the optics of the marriage, not to me. Do you want to respond? Yes. Sandra picked up a pen. Margaret spoke. James, I acknowledge receipt of your letter. I don't accept language that reduces a sustained pattern of disrespect, concealment and delegated humiliation to blurred boundaries or an unacceptable moment. All further communication should proceed through counsel. Sandra looked up. That's all. That's all. The response went out that afternoon. James read it in the apartment he was renting now, a furnished place downtown with no view and furniture that didn't belong to him. He threw the response across the room. It landed near a box of items retrieved from his former office. Awards, a business biography he'd been photographed holding but never read, a framed photo from a gala Margaret had organized 3 years ago. In the photo, James was smiling at the camera. Margaret was looking at him. He picked it up. He remembered that night. She had privately secured a major donor who saved the hospital campaign James had publicly taken credit for. He'd taken the microphone and thanked everyone for supporting his family's philanthropic vision. In the car home, Margaret had asked why he hadn't mentioned her team's work. He'd told her not to be petty. The memory didn't arrive with thunder, it arrived with nausea. He put the photo face down. The restaurant became a character in its own right. Vellum's owner, Carlo Marchetti, was furious in the restrained way of men who had spent decades building something and watched it become someone else's headline. He sent Margaret a handwritten note and offered to host any future private event at no charge. Margaret declined the complimentary offer. She accepted a private conversation. They met on a Tuesday afternoon before evening service. The dining room looked entirely different without the performance layer. No candles, no waiting investors, just tables set in quiet light. Carlo was a precise man with careful hands, and the practiced warmth of someone who had spent 30 years making difficult situations feel temporary. Mrs. Calloway, he said, I owe you an apology. Your staff handled it correctly the moment it happened, Margaret said. What happened in that room happened because of decisions made before anyone arrived. Carlo nodded, visibly relieved by the precision. We've revised our security protocols for private bookings. Good, Margaret walked to the chair where she'd been seated, touched the back of it lightly. Would you host a dinner here next month? She asked. Carlo paused. Of course, for whom? Women founders from Callaway's portfolio, legal clinic directors, some employees from Pinnacle Bridge who cooperated with the governance review. No keynote, no panel, just dinner. Carlo's expression softened. Same room. Same room. May I ask why? Margaret turned from the table. Because I'd rather the worst thing that happened here not be the last thing that happened here. Carlo bowed slightly. Then we'll make it worth coming back to. The dinner took place 5 weeks later. Margaret chose deep red roses and eucalyptus branches and low candles in amber glass. Women filled the table with overlapping conversation that didn't lower its voice. A founder talked about navigating investor harassment in her second year. A legal director from Pinnacle Bridge described what it cost her to stay quiet for too long. Rosa attended as Margaret's guest and informed a venture capitalist, unprompted, that his watch was louder than his resume. Margaret laughed until her cheek remembered itself in old muscle memory. That night the room changed ownership, not in any deed or document, just in the way rooms sometimes shift when the right people sit in them and refuse to be quiet. Pinnacle Bridge survived. That bothered James more than its collapse would have. Under David Rees's interim leadership, the company completed a leaner, cleaner version of the North Star acquisition. Callaway Trust released financing in tranches tied to oversight benchmarks. Employees kept their jobs. Executive spending was cut significantly. Diane's consulting agreements were terminated. The board appointed an independent ethics director with the personality of a filed motion and the memory of a court reporter. Within 6 months, the stock had stabilized. Within 8, analysts began describing the company as more disciplined under new leadership. More disciplined. James read those words like a betrayal. In his mind, Pinnacle Bridge without him should have stumbled. It should have proved that his flaws were the inevitable price of his particular genius. Instead, the company became quieter and more functional. Meetings started on time. Department heads said what they actually thought. David gave credit to teams publicly. Investors, it turned out, liked accurate information more than James had ever believed possible. Margaret watched from a proper distance. She didn't become CEO. She didn't want James's chair. That disappointed the gossip coverage, which preferred narratives where women took thrones from fallen men and sat in them wearing sharper blazers. Margaret's victory was less decorative and more structural. At a quarterly review, David presented the first clean compliance report. No undisclosed executive personal expenses, he said. Margaret nodded. Good. Employee retention is above projection. Better. North Star integration is running 2 weeks behind revised schedule, but within cost range. Acceptable. David lowered the document. I'd like to say something off agenda. Margaret waited. I should have come forward earlier, about Diane's access levels, about James's spending, about the way he talked about you to investors. The room was quiet. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Yes, you should have. He absorbed that without flinching. I'm sorry. Don't only apologize to me, she said. Build a company where the next person who notices something wrong doesn't have to choose between their job and their conscience. David nodded slowly. We're trying to. Try in writing. He almost smiled. Policy draft by end of week. Margaret approved the report. That was how repair began, not with speeches, with mechanisms. Diane settled quietly. She agreed to cooperate fully with the board review, return disputed items of value, repay a portion of unauthorized benefits, and make no public statements. In exchange, Pinnacle Bridge didn't pursue broader civil claims. The restaurant matter was resolved through a diversion program, a formal written apology, and 40 hours of community service. Some online commentators called it too lenient. Margaret disagreed. Diane had lost the borrowed apartment, the borrowed proximity to James's authority, the borrowed narrative in which she was the only woman who truly understood a brilliant man. She had also lost the belief that diminishing another woman was the same as winning. That was consequence enough. 3 months after the settlement, Diane requested a private meeting. Christine advised against it. Margaret accepted under conditions. Neutral office, counsel nearby, 30 minutes. Diane arrived in a simple grey dress, her hair darker than Margaret remembered, no silver earrings, no theatrical presentation. Without James's orbit around her, she looked like what she'd always been, a woman who had made a series of terrible choices for a man who wasn't worth a single one. Thank you for seeing me, Diane said. You have 26 minutes. Diane nodded, accepting the terms. I wanted to apologize in person, she said, not through attorneys. Then do it. She swallowed. I'm sorry I hit you. I'm sorry for the things I said at that table. I told myself you were arrogant because James kept telling me you were. It was easier to resent you than to admit I was helping him betray you. Margaret listened. I wanted your position, Diane said, voice thinner. Not your marriage, your certainty. The way you could walk into a room and it rearranged itself around you without you asking. I thought if I could make you seem smaller, James would finally see me as essential. She paused. Did it work? Margaret asked. I became useful. The word landed between them. Margaret thought of every woman she'd ever known who had been taught to compete for a man's approval, without stopping to ask whether the approval was worth wanting. James used you, Margaret said. That doesn't erase what you chose. I know. Good. Do you forgive me? Diane asked. Margaret considered the clean, generous answer, the one that wrapped everything into resolution and made a good ending. Instead, she told the truth. "No," she said, "but I'm not carrying you anymore." Diane nodded. Tears moved down her face despite her best effort at composure. Margaret walked out lighter than she'd entered. James's deposition was a masterclass in failing to perform sincerity. He arrived with Richard Vance wearing a well-cut suit and the expression of a man determined to seem cooperative on camera. He answered the early questions carefully. Yes, Diane was his assistant. Yes, she attended the dinner. Yes, he regretted the incident. No, he didn't instruct her to strike Margaret. Then Sandra began reading his messages. James to Diane, "Margaret needs to remember tonight belongs to me." James to Diane, "If she starts asking her little committee questions, redirect Scott. I need him in a good mood." James to Diane, "Handle her. I can't afford one of her quiet ambushes tonight." James shifted in his chair. "Those weren't meant literally." "How were they meant?" Sandra asked. "I meant manage the flow of the evening." "You used the phrase handle her. In what context is your wife something to be handled?" Richard objected. Sandra rephrased. "At the time you sent these messages, did you believe Diane Foster had authority to direct Mrs. Calloway's seating, conversations, and participation in the dinner?" "I believed Diane had authority to manage the event." "Including guests?" "Including the flow of the evening, yes." "Including your wife?" James exhaled. "Yes." The word cost him something. Margaret watched from the adjoining room. No triumph, just cold confirmation of something she had suspected for years. James hadn't thought of her as a partner, he had thought of her as a logistics variable. Sandra continued, "Why did you never disclose to Ms. Foster that Mrs. Calloway chaired the Calloway Trust Investment Committee?" "It was confidential." "You shared confidential investor materials with Ms. Foster." "That was operationally different." "How?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out that would hold weight. That silence did more work than any clever follow-up question. At the end of the deposition, James looked diminished, not destroyed, not redeemed, just stripped of the lighting and framing that had always made him look larger than the room. On camera, under oath, charisma has nowhere to sit. The divorce finalized 14 months after the dinner. No courtroom drama, no testimony. Most of it happened in quiet conference rooms through settlement drafts, asset schedules, and clauses negotiated until each comma had earned its placement. The final hearing took 22 minutes. Margaret wore a deep navy, James wore charcoal. The judge reviewed the agreement, confirmed understanding, and signed the decree. Separate property remained separate. The townhouse stayed with Margaret's trust. James retained a reduced equity position subject to clawback obligations and board restrictions. Both parties agreed to non-disparagement, though the public record already contained enough documented truth to make insults unnecessary. In the hallway outside, James asked for a moment. Sandra looked at Margaret. Margaret nodded. They stood near a window. Below them, people moved through the courthouse steps with folders and coffee cups and the ordinary emergencies of ordinary lives. James looked at Margaret's face. The bruise had been gone for months. He still seemed to see it. "I'm sorry," he said. She waited. "Not for the optics, not for what it cost the company," he swallowed, "for standing still while she hit you, for creating a marriage where she thought she could, for making corrections sound like something you deserved." The apology came late. It was also the first one that named the actual wound. "Thank you for saying that," Margaret said. Hope moved through his expression, the reflex of a man used to the right words opening doors. "She didn't open one." "It doesn't change anything," she said gently. His eyes lowered. "I know." "Do you?" He gave a small, pained sound. "I'm trying to." They stood in the quiet for a moment. "Was I always like this?" James asked. Margaret looked out the window. "No." That seemed to hurt him more than yes would have. "When did it change?" he asked. "When you started treating gratitude as a weakness and access as ownership." He nodded slowly, taking in what he could. "Margaret left first." Outside, the air was sharp and clean. She didn't feel victorious. Victory is too loud a word for the end of a marriage. She felt unburdened, which is quieter and considerably more useful. After the divorce, Margaret changed the dining room. Not because it held memories of James. He had always preferred restaurants where people could see him enter. But she had come to understand that homes record what their owners tolerate. Her dining room had become too formal, too arranged for the comfort of other people. She replaced the long mahogany table with a round one. Rosa approved. Better, nobody gets the power seat. That wasn't exactly the design brief. It should have been. Margaret invited friends for dinner the following weekend. Not investors, not board members, friends. Carolyn, who ran a legal aid clinic in Evanston. Her cousin Theo, who brought intentionally bad wine as a joke and excellent wine in a second bag. Tanya, who arrived carrying sunflowers. Christine came late with dessert, and 3 attorney jokes no one outside litigation would understand. They ate too much pasta. They argued about a movie. Rosa joined them for coffee after pretending she was only checking the kitchen. Margaret watched the room fill with overlapping voices and understood, for the first time in years, how long she had confused peace with quiet. Quiet could be control. Peace had room for noise. Near midnight, Carolyn raised her glass to Margaret's new table. Theo added, and to the end of lily arrangements selected by someone else. Theodore, Carolyn said. Too specific. Margaret laughed, accurate. The laughter didn't erase anything. It did something more useful. It placed the past among people who loved her, where it became a story she could tell without making herself smaller in the telling. After everyone left, Margaret stood in the doorway and looked at the round table, plates stacked, candles burned low, a wine ring on the linen. Evidence of life, not performance. Rosa came to stand beside her. Good room now, she said. Margaret nodded. Yes, she said, good room. Callaway Trust revised its financing policies the following quarter. The new standards required expanded disclosure of personal relationships between executive assistants, consultants, romantic partners, and event staff, whenever those individuals had access to confidential investor materials. A direct reporting channel was also created for employees who faced pressure to manage, redirect, or monitor the spouses or partners of company executives at professional events. Some longtime partners found it excessive. At the policy review session, an outside advisor named Jeffrey Warren, the kind of man who had made a career out of sounding reasonable while resisting change, said, "Aren't we at risk of overcorrecting from one unpleasant incident?" Margaret looked at him across the table. A woman was physically assaulted at a financing dinner following months of undisclosed access, unauthorized expense activity, and systematic pressure to manage her participation in her own husband's company. Which part are you calling unpleasant? Jeffrey cleared his throat. I only mean policy shouldn't be emotionally driven. Good, this one has definitions. Tanya, seated just behind her, studied the ceiling. The policy passed. Afterward, a junior analyst named Priya waited outside Margaret's office, 25, sharp, and carrying the particular nervousness of someone with something important to say. Ms. Callaway, may I speak with you confidentially? You may speak with me privately. Confidential is a legal term. Priya nodded. At my previous company, a senior partner had assistants rate the wives and partners of other executives after events. Who helped, who hindered, who needed redirecting. I thought it was normal until I read the new policy and realized I'd been part of it. Margaret felt something cold and steady move through her. Do you have documentation? Some old emails. Send them to Christine. We won't use your name without your explicit consent. Priya's shoulders loosened. Thank you. After she left, Margaret sat in the quiet for a moment. There it was again. Pain becoming infrastructure. Not because suffering was ennobling, but because unexamined suffering becomes tradition. And eventually someone has to interrupt the tradition and write a rule that makes the next person slightly safer. She added a note to the policy implementation memo. Don't design systems for the most well-behaved, powerful person. Design them for the worst one who can gain access. It wasn't elegant, it was useful. That distinction mattered more to her now than it once had. James tried to return to professional visibility 8 months after the divorce. He appeared on a podcast called Rebuilding from the Inside, warm lighting, a leather chair, a measured voice talking about humility, difficult seasons, and what leadership looks like after a fall. He didn't name Margaret. He said a painful personal and professional convergence. He said leaders sometimes lose perspective under sustained pressure. He said he had taken full accountability. Tanya forwarded Margaret the clip with a single question: respond. Margaret watched 40 seconds. Lose perspective, the fog machine running again. She replied, no, monitor. The internet responded on her behalf. Viewers pulled deposition transcripts from public filings. They quoted James's messages verbatim. They posted the restaurant footage with frame-by-frame timestamps. They asked at length and with considerable energy why men who created conditions for harm described those conditions as weather. The podcast episode was removed within 36 hours. James didn't record another. That evening he called Richard Vance. Was it really that obvious? James asked. Richard sighed. You spoke around the facts were already public. I said I took accountability. Accountability without specificity is just a press release. James sat in his rented apartment looking at the brick wall his window faced. He'd taken a consulting role with a regional freight company in Indiana. The work was operational and unglamorous. Nobody there knew his name from before. It was the most honest work he'd done in years. What would real accountability sound like? He asked. Richard considered the question longer than James expected. It would sound like, I treated my wife as infrastructure. I gave another woman authority over her dignity. I minimized violence when it threatened my deal flow. I lost the trust of my board because I'd stopped being trustworthy with it. James closed his eyes. That's not exactly podcast-friendly. No, Richard said. Truth rarely optimizes for brand recovery. James didn't argue. He never recorded the honest version publicly, but that night he wrote it down in a notebook he kept in his desk drawer. That wasn't redemption. It was a start too private to impress anyone, which meant it might have actually been real. Diane found work at a non-profit arts organization in Denver. Margaret learned this only because Christine included it in a final compliance update. The role was administrative, far from investor dinners and corporate financing structures. All settlement terms had been honored, community service completed, required repayments made, no subsequent violations. Do you want continued monitoring? Christine asked. Margaret looked at the report. No. You're certain? If she violates the agreement, we'll know. If she rebuilds quietly, that's not my concern. Christine closed the folder. That afternoon Margaret walked through a Callaway Trust founder reception. The room moved with ambition, young founders pitching healthcare platforms, logistics software, financial tools, education systems. Margaret listened carefully and noticed who answered questions directly versus who performed confidence like a costume they were still breaking in. A founder named Layla stopped her near the window, mid-30s, sharp, fingers tight around her glass. May I ask you something? Yes. How do you know the difference between someone who's genuinely helping you and someone who's slowly positioning themselves over you? Margaret gave her full attention. Layla's voice dropped slightly. My operations advisor keeps telling investors I'm brilliant but emotional. He says it like a compliment. They laugh. I know it's not a compliment, but he has relationships I need to close my next round. Margaret felt the dining room around her for 1 second. White lilies, a red dress, no manners. Affection can still be a leash, Margaret said. Layla absorbed that. Put his role in writing, define the scope of his authority, bring an independent party into investor conversations he currently controls alone. If he resists the clarity, he wasn't helping you build. He was positioning himself above you. Layla nodded slowly. Thank you. And Layla, Margaret added. Yes. Don't wait until he strikes you with someone else's hand. The founder's face shifted in a way that meant the sentence had landed exactly where it needed to. That was the point. The vellum dinner became an annual tradition. Not a gala. Margaret had grown to dislike the word gala, the way it turned gatherings into performances and made attendance into a credential. It was a dinner for women who had survived rooms where smiling through disrespect was treated as professionalism, and for the men and women willing to spend an evening talking honestly about how to build better rooms. Founders, attorneys, operators, analysts, nurses, emergency housing directors, 2 judges, and 1 year, a retired teacher who had been running a financial literacy program for foster youth for 23 years and had never once been invited to a venture capital dinner. She and Rosa became fast friends over dessert. The first year, people still whispered about the slap. The second year, they talked about policy. The third year, they talked about money and structure, and what it actually took to change a room before something broke. That third year pleased Margaret most. Pain could open a door. It shouldn't be the only conversation allowed inside. At the third dinner, Carlo placed deep red roses on every table, as he had every year. Rosa attended each time and had become, inexplicably, beloved by women who ran companies worth more than some small nations. She gave blunt advice over coffee and accepted compliments the way a judge accepts a weak argument, with patience and no visible enthusiasm. Scott Henderson raised a glass during dessert. To Margaret, he said, who taught half this city the difference between silence and discretion. Margaret shook her head. Dangerous toast. Accurate toast. She stood reluctantly. I'll add one thing, she said. The table quieted. Discretion protects dignity. Silence protects whoever benefits from your fear. Learn the difference before someone else defines it for you. Glasses lifted. The applause didn't remind her of the restaurant after the slap. It reminded her that rooms could change, not by accident, but by witness, by policy, by money, by memory, and by the stubborn refusal to let humiliation be the final scene. After dinner, Margaret stood by the window looking out at Chicago's lights. Christine joined her. You reclaimed it, Christine said. The room. More than the rooms. Margaret looked at the table, at the roses, at the women laughing without lowering their voices, at Rosa holding court at the far end with an expression of serene authority. Maybe, she said quietly. But the answer in her chest was already yes. Years later, Margaret found the incident report while reorganizing her study. It had been filed with documents from the divorce, settlement papers, board minutes, policy drafts, letters from women she'd never met who had found her statement in the Callaway Trust annual letter and written to tell her what it meant to them. The incident report was thinner than memory. Date, time, location, names assault by open hand, responding strike, evidence preserved, parties separated. So clinical, so quiet, so small on the page. She sat at her desk and read it again. The woman in that report felt familiar and distant at the same time. A wife in a charcoal dress, a burning cheek, a room full of people waiting to see whether she would make violence convenient for them. Margaret wanted to reach through the paper and put a hand on that woman's shoulder. Not to tell her to be brave, she had been brave. To tell her that bravery would become ordinary again, that one day she would eat in that room without tasting humiliation, that James's name would eventually sound like a chapter rather than a verdict, that Diane would become less a rival than a cautionary outline of a woman who had chosen the wrong thing to want. That one day the hand across her face would not be the most important hand in her story. The most important hand was her own. The one that struck back. The one that signed the report. The one that wrote new policies. The one that opened her own front door. Rosa appeared in the doorway. Old trouble. Old evidence, Margaret said. Same drawer. Not anymore. She placed the incident report in a new folder. She labeled it simply, history, not active, not urgent, not identity. History. Then she closed the drawer. On the last page of Callaway Trust's annual letter that year, Margaret wrote a note her communications team tried to soften 3 times. She changed it back each time. It read, There are moments when disrespect stops whispering and raises its hand. Believe that moment. Don't rush to make it smaller because someone is watching. Don't protect the person who built the room where it happened. A boundary isn't the loss of manners. A boundary is the place where your life begins answering to you again. She signed it, Margaret Calloway. The note travelled farther than the acquisition, farther than the restaurant footage, farther than James's failed podcast or the deposition transcripts or the board minutes. Women sent it to their daughters, assistants forwarded it to each other before difficult meetings, founders printed it and taped it inside notebooks before investor presentations. Someone quoted it at a wedding toast, which Margaret found simultaneously alarming and deeply touching. At home, she hosted Sunday dinners at the round table. Rosa made too much food and was unapologetic about it. Theo brought good wine after 3 years of threats. Christine and Tanya argued about whether legal dramas had permanently damaged public understanding of evidence. Carolyn fell asleep briefly in the armchair by the bookshelf and dennied it with magnificent composure. Margaret watched them and felt something she hadn't felt in years. The deep, unperformed quiet of a life no longer organized around someone else's comfort. The doorbell rang. Rosa answered and came back with a small envelope. No return address. Inside was a card from David Rees. Reporting policy became permanent policy today. The channel was used 5 times this quarter. 3 issues were identified and addressed early. Thought you'd want to know. Margaret read it twice. Then she placed it on the mantel beside a photograph of her grandmother, taken in 1971, standing in front of a building she had purchased without telling anyone she'd planned to. That was the ending Margaret preferred. Not James ruined in the street, not Diane in perpetual consequences, not endless applause for a slap returned. Systems changed, people spoke sooner, rooms became safer. And Margaret, who had once been told she had no manners because she refused to move her chair, sat at the head of no table at all. She sat among people who loved her. That was better. 4 years after the dinner at Vellum, Margaret returned there for an evening that had nothing to do with James, Diane, the acquisition, or any of the machinery that had made that night necessary. It was Rosa's birthday. Rosa had resisted the idea for 2 weeks. She said expensive restaurants put foam on food that didn't need it and charged people for empty space on the plate. Margaret ignored her with great affection and booked the private room anyway. Not for spectacle, because Rosa had stood at the front door and turned James away in the rain with the moral authority of someone who had made her decision long before the crisis arrived. That deserved more than cake at the kitchen table. The room looked softer in its 4th year. Carlo had changed the lighting after Margaret once mentioned that the old fixture made everyone look like they were about to be deposed. Deep pink roses this time, because Rosa said red was theatrical unless someone had either died or apologized properly. Rosa sat beside Margaret in a navy dress, inspecting the bread basket with professional suspicion. "You're checking the bill," Margaret said. "I'm protecting you from garnish charges." Theo laughed. Carolyn pretended not to. Midway through dinner, the new room manager approached with a bottle of champagne from Carlo. She was young, careful, clearly aware of the room's history. Rosa examined the label and gave one small nod. The young woman practically glowed. After dessert, Margaret stepped into the corridor alone. She stood near the spot where Diane had been escorted out, near the place where James had tried to reduce everything into a private matter, near where she had first understood that refusing to hide something was its own kind of statement. Her phone buzzed. A message from David. 3rd clean audit cycle complete. Reporting channel adopted by 2 more companies in the portfolio. Turnover down. Rooms are safer because you refused to call that night a scene. Margaret read it twice. Then she put her phone away and walked back to the table. Back to Rosa, arguing cheerfully with Theo about whether the dessert merited a 3rd spoon. Back to the roses and the candles, and the laughter that didn't apologize for itself. Not because the past had disappeared. Because it no longer had to walk ahead of her. If this story stayed with you, please like and subscribe to Hidden Karma Stories. It means more than you know. And I want to ask you something in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city, your country, even just your continent. I genuinely read every single comment. You'd be surprised how far this community reaches. And if you've ever had to decide between keeping peace and keeping your dignity, this one was for you.